Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I'm going to discuss today's Prime Minister's questions, where Boris Johnson faced questions from backbenchers, but more specifically 6 questions from the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, and 2 from the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford, but also where the Prime Minister told the truth, quite inadvertently. Oh, it was a total accident, I assure you. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So just before PMQs, there were actually a load of questions about Scotland. So there were also some feeding into PMQs as well. And so just before Keir Starmer got to ask his questions, one Conservative backbencher actually asked, he talked about the success, and this was not a question to Boris Johnson really, so I shouldn't really put this in video, but just because it was a general theme that emerged. And he asked the Minister for Scotland if, given the success of devolution in Scotland, there might be some lessons for devolution in England to happen. I thought, oh, that's interesting. And the Minister said, do you think you'll find that England has seen further devolution? To which I was thinking, I'm not quite sure what he means there. He may be alluding to the role of elected mayors in cities in London. It's not really the same thing because, you know, if you take the Scottish government, for example, they have their devolved areas, which Westminster cannot interfere with. It can have a say on it, but at the end of the day, the Scottish government says, no, this is our toy. We're playing with it however we like. Then that's all there is to it. Whereas Westminster can, of course, overrule any of the, you know, more powerful elected mayors than used to be the case. So it's not really the case. But anyway, then, you know, the question of the independence referendum came up. Well, actually, that was a bit earlier, I think. And I thought it was quite interesting because there was a suggestion, even though later on the minister said, oh, people of Scotland absolutely don't want this. It's like, well, isn't that what a referendum's to decide? But anyway, there seemed to be an illusion that we shouldn't really be dealing with the issue of whether or not there should be an independence referendum because we're trying to deal with coronavirus, to which you naturally then think, oh, isn't that also an argument for not messing about with Brexit and just extending the transition period? Which we can't now do without changing the law, so there you go. On to Boris Johnson anyway. So he began by marking the birthday of the NHS and saying what a great institution it was and how we'll always be there to support it. Yeah, okay. On to Keir's questions, the one that elicited an accidental telling of the truth from Boris Johnson, I think it was. So he also echoed the sentiments of celebrating the birthday at the NHS, rather more, genuinely, I would imagine here. And then he reminded the Prime Minister of on the 18th of June when the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, talked about an outbreak in parts of Leicester. And then pointed out that actually it's now only this week that restrictions have been reimposed in Leicester. And he says, why were the government so slow to act on this? To which Boris Johnson said, well, actually, we took notice on the 8th of June. At which point I would be thinking to myself, so hang on, how come it took 10 days for you to say anything then? Because this did not become widely known for much later. But anyway, so what he said was we sent mobile testing units shortly afterwards and we actively coordinated with groups in Leicester. Now, on that point, I straight away, before even, you know, the counter came back, thought that's a little bit odd because even when the government imposed the tighter local lockdown in Leicester this week, they didn't tell the council. So Leicester Council, or Leicestershire Council really is, isn't it? It's a county council. But nonetheless, the local council had not been fully briefed by the government. They tweeted that themselves. They were saying, you know, they were trying to get the message out there about, you know, going back into a mini lockdown, but also having to say, but we haven't received details from the government. So the government weren't even talking to the local authority on this one. So the idea that they coordinated with people locally in Leicester seems to me to be unlikely. It sounds to me what they probably did is to tell people what to do without telling them why or without letting them coordinate or link up or have any idea what they were doing. And what he said was, he says, but the problem in Leicester is that the measures didn't seem to work as they had elsewhere, suggesting that they'd done these same things in other areas where there'd also been outbreaks and it had worked in those other areas. And he says that's why they then imposed the restrictions. But he referred to his whack-a-mole strategy with regards to these local lockdowns. Now, here's the thing. Whack-a-mole is not a widely used term in the UK. And I'm quite sure Boris Johnson didn't fully appreciate this. I didn't fully appreciate it until it was pointed out. So then I had a little look up. And you know, whack-a-mole to me just means the arcade game, an American arcade game. You bash, you know, plastic moles with a hammer. And you can understand why he would attribute that to the idea of dealing with local flare-ups. You know, a thing happens, you react to it. And then another thing might happen to someone else and you react to it. Unfortunately, there is a dictionary definition for the term. A dictionary definition. Would you like to hear what it is? It says, used with reference to a situation in which attempts to solve a problem are piecemeal or superficial, resulting only in temporary or minor improvement. I mean, that is actually honest, isn't it? That is his attitude. You know, piecemeal and superficial measures that will prove to only provide temporary or minor improvement. I don't think Boris Johnson is aware of that definition, because otherwise he might have chose a different term for it. And I'm sure Sir Keir Starmer wasn't either, otherwise I'm sure he would have pointed it out. But there you are. I mean, Boris Johnson, if he's going to insist on using that term without qualifying it in any way, has basically suggesting that he has got a strategy that is superficial, that will provide, at best, temporary improvements. Also has an IT definition regarding, you know, the idea of dealing with a problem only for another one to flare up elsewhere and you never actually solve the problem. That would also fit. But anyway, Keir Starmer then got up and he said, you know, because Boris Johnson, again, you've noticed this the last couple of weeks, potentially, he keeps trying to say, oh, you know, he should support us, he should support these measures, or he says he supports these measures and then he attacks these measures. And of course, Keir Starmer's point is, I'm supporting the measures, I'm just not supporting the fact that you are arsing them up. And he said he supported the decision on Monday to put Leicester into tighter restrictions. But he says the problem is you're delaying it, and the way you're doing it is businesses and schools may need some persuading that the government has acted quickly enough. And he also pointed out, and it was obviously going to build up to this, you knew this was going to come in early on. So what had happened was, and I had to do a separate video on this, the local authority, much like local authorities across the country, would have been completely unaware of the scale of the outbreak because the government are not sharing data with them. And Keir Starmer noted that they had only, in fact, he noted the mayor of Leicester saying that the local authorities had only received what's called Pillar 1 data. Now, this is data to do with COVID infections in hospitals. Settings like that. It doesn't include Pillar 2, which is results from like mobile testing and testing out in the community and all that sort of stuff that's separate to the hospitals. And the thing is, of course, as you know, infections and positive tests in hospitals has been coming down, that is not the case elsewhere. So the vast majority of positive tests are actually in the Pillar 2 data, which the local authority had no idea about. So they thought, this is what Keir Starmer said, he said it sounds technical, but what it means is that the local authority thought there were far fewer infections than there really were. He was pointing out, you know, they thought there were like 100 odd, and actually it was about 800 or 900 new infections. So the figures that they were getting were a lot less than the real figures because of this missing data. And he said, as a result of this, we need to be fearful of further local lockdowns because these local authorities will now be thinking to themselves, what do we not know? And he said, can the Prime Minister guarantee that no other local authority will be put in this position again, where they just do not know? And the Prime Minister said that the Leader of the Opposition is mistaken. He says both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 data have been shared with local authorities. Now, this is interesting because I know directly from local authorities saying otherwise. People on the local authority are saying this is not the case. They are only receiving Pillar 1 data. And they've said this as recently as yesterday as well. And it also has to be said that we as members of the public can't get access to this either, because this should be publicly available data too. We don't have access to it. So that's sort of, you know, so Boris Johnson is trying to suggest that all local authorities are lying And then we'd look at it and go, okay, who's likely to be lying? Boris Johnson or every local authority in England? And also you add into that, well, actually, should I just not be able to look it up myself and see? Oh, I can't find this data myself as a member of the public. Yeah, okay, I think I know who's probably lying. Then Starmer stood up and said that he'd spoken personally to the Mayor of Leicester, and he was clear that he didn't get the data. He was absolutely clear on that. He didn't get the data until very recently. He is at it now, but far too late. And he says that he knows the Prime Minister was also in talks with this person, and the Mayor was unlikely to have told the Prime Minister something different to what he'd been told. And he says the Prime Minister cannot keep batting away challenges like this. This is a theme he carried on from last week, saying that the Prime Minister, when presented with challenges, rather than take them on, he just bats them away as irrelevant. And he talked about, an MP from a seaside tourist area constituency, Hove. It was Brighton, Hove, is it? And he said they had asked the Prime Minister, how can they cope with the influx? This was earlier on. How can they possibly cope with the influxes as the result of the easing of the lockdowns that were about to be announced? And Starmer noted that the Prime Minister, in response to this, said, show some guts. And then 2 days later, there was a major incident declared at Bournemouth, having to be shut down because of a massive influx of people. And he says, does the Prime Minister regret being so flippant? At which point, you've seen a very clear thing coming from Prime Minister's questions, and this encapsulated it perfectly. You've got Keir Starmer standing up, very calm, very methodical in what he's saying. And when he's countering Johnson, again, he quotes people who would be in a position to know. And all very calm. And then Boris Johnson stands up and just shouts and blusters. And he did it here as well. And he was saying, he made it very, very clear that, that with my plans, and he says, my cautious plans for reopening, not really cautious, are they? But anyway, he says tourist areas should be as welcoming as they can, but it's also vital that people have to behave responsibly. And here's the thing we were warning about weeks and weeks ago, weren't we? And we all knew Boris Johnson wanted to ease the lockdown, but in a way that doesn't blame himself. He will blame the people of Britain. The people of Britain, he said, he trusts British common sense to see us through this. When he was asked about this guidance doesn't really help people, it's not clear, and he said, come on, it's common sense. We could trust the British common sense here. And this was ages ago, and we said, he's storing this up so that when people don't behave as we know they need to, he'll just blame them. And that's what he's doing now. And he's saying that's why Bournemouth was such a shit show. That wasn't his words. He's blaming people. He says it's people's fault. People have to take responsibility. And it's their fault. It's not our fault for unclear guidance. It's not our fault for saying that people should go to these places. No, it's their fault for actually going to them. Anyway, Starmer then stood up and says, look, the Prime Minister has to understand why this is a concern. He says, without an app, he says, without data for local authorities, without this world-beating system we were promised, he says, the difference is between Starmer and Johnson. Starmer supports the intentions and the efforts to ease the restrictions, but he's not blind to the risks. He noted last week, and he said this, that with regard to the tracing programme, 2/3 of people that were testing positive with COVID-19 were not being contacted by the tracers to get details of people they may be in contact with in order to implement the isolation part of the strategy. He said it's got even worse this week. Now, 3/4 of people testing positive are not being contacted. So the tracing programme is actually going backwards. It's not actually, it's not like it was having teething problems from first launch and it's now getting better. It's actually getting worse. And it is getting worse as well, because it's not just proportionally worse. Obviously, if the number of new infections was going up, you'd think, okay, it just can't cope. There's too many infections for it to cope, which is actually also probably true. In fact, certainly true. But the number of new infections has actually come down. So if the proportion of people being contacted is lower, then the system is actively getting worse. And he says, how does the Prime Minister explain this? To which Boris Johnson stood up and says, actually, I think you'll find we're reaching huge numbers of people. And then the leader of the opposition couldn't possibly have guessed we'd be reaching as many as we are now. And that's why we are seeing and the number of new infections and deaths coming down, which of course is not answering the question, because what is a huge number of people is if, just as an objective figure, subjective. You might contact 5,000 people and say, well, that's a lot of people. But is it as many people as needed contacted? No, because if that's only a quarter of the people that should have been contacted, then actually it's not a huge figure. What matters is how... And also bear in mind that Boris Johnson said that the system can cope with 10,000 new infections a day. 10,000. We don't have anywhere near that. And that's 10,000 new infections, obviously, when the tracers ultimately, after the clinicians have talked to those 10,000, if you had 10,000, they'd then get onto the contact tracers to contact the people they've been in contact with. So that would be tens and tens of thousands. No, we're managing a few thousand. And that's not a few thousand people contacted that have been infected. We're talking about the ones who need to be contacted as well, that have been in contact with them. Using the word contact an awful lot here, but it is about contact. So, yeah. Starmer then stood up and he said, look, if the Prime Minister cannot see that 3/4 of people not being contacted is a huge gap in the system, then I don't know. He says it's a real problem and it's growing, and it is. If 2/3 of people weren't contacted last week and this week it's 3/4, he says the Prime Minister keeps brushing away these concerns. And then he came on to Johnson's speech yesterday about his New Deal for Britain, and he says the Prime Minister said that we know, and this was in his speech yesterday, we know that the jobs that many people held in January are not coming back. So in other words, your jobs are gone forever. And then Starmer relayed a similar line that Boris Johnson gave in March about COVID. And he said, he quoted him and said, I must level with you, many more families are going to lose loved ones before their time. And then Starmer says, and we know what happened next. He says, how many jobs will his speech yesterday protect? How many? What's a figure? Now, obviously, Johnson didn't give a figure. He ranted on about his figures for spending, but said, of course, he's not going to put a figure on how many jobs he's going to protect. Well, that's interesting. Of course not, because then it would be an easy calculation for us, wouldn't it? Because we know how many jobs have been lost. And if he says how many jobs his measures are going to protect, not only will there then be follow-up questions later on about how exactly this measure is going to protect these jobs, but also you can just do a quick calculation, can't you? Number of jobs lost minus number of jobs he says he's going to protect equals number of jobs he's abandoning. So, of course, he couldn't answer that. Then he went on about the £600 billion of spending in total because, and you think, oh, is this in the next one? The thing is, though, you say, oh, £600 billion of spending. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, that's the tax receipts, isn't it? It's a little bit less than the tax receipts. Obviously, some of it has to go on servicing our debt. All you're really doing is saying that you're going to spend the money that you're raising in taxes. Well, yeah, all governments do that. The question really should be, why isn't it more? Why isn't it more? And in fact, it has to be noted, I'll note at this point, that, when he announced his spending plans, people who analyse these spending plans say it's actually going to cost more than this. You're going to have to raise taxes, which he also alluded to yesterday. So then Starmer got, now, sixth question with Starmer, I always have to sort of note this. Whatever he says, he has to, there's no point in asking a question that the Prime Minister would be easily able to bat away, because it's his sixth question, he doesn't get a comeback. So you just come out with a question that's just a series of objective facts, really, for people watching in. So he said that the promises yesterday by Boris Johnson amounted to 0.2% of GDP and less than £100 per person. He said he quoted the job losses in a number of companies, reeled them off like EasyJet and so on. And he said, this is just yesterday. This is thousands of job losses just announced yesterday, in one day. And he said there was nothing in his speech for the millions working in hospitality or the millions working in retail, which of course are two very heavily hit industries. Hospitality, of course, arguably the worst hit, if you include tourism in there as well, and like travel. It says, will the Prime Minister start to help by extending the furlough scheme for the parts of the economy most affected? So he's suggesting that, okay, you're wanting to change the furlough scheme now for, parts of the economy that can get back. Okay, what about the ones who can't? Because he said there's basically a week left. There needs to be an announcement next week that'll put these industries' minds at ease. The implication is that there are businesses working in these industries that are just waiting to see if the government will do anything for them, and if they won't, they're going to have to shut up shop or announce mass redundancies, at least. To which the Prime Minister said, he says the best thing the opposition can do is to stop saying one thing one week and another the next. Just get behind us, get behind us. And he banged on about schools again, nothing to do with anything. And he says, we are the builders, they are the blockers. And it is a shame. It is a real shame there's no comeback to that, because I know what the comeback would be, or at least I know what I hope it would be. You're the builder, are you, Boris? Boris the builder. That's interesting, because first of all, I can point to the fact that the Conservative government, if you want to compare building programmes under the last Labour government and then this Conservative government, that's not really going to stack up. And then look at Boris Johnson personally. He announced lots of building plans when he was Mayor of London as well. How many of them came to fruition? I wouldn't be drawing attention to that if I were Boris Johnson, but of course he knew there could be no comeback. Now, then there was the two questions from Ian Blackford, leader of the SNP, as the second largest opposition party in Parliament. Now, before that, there was a question from a Tory backbencher, and it was a very divisive one from a Tory MP banging on about the threat. So the Scottish Government I don't know whether they're serious about this or not, but I'm not sure I would blame them if they were, but I have talked about this being very politically contentious. And the Scottish Government have sort of loudly wondered if maybe, because, they are getting a much better grip on the infection than England, if maybe they need to prevent people just passing into Scotland from England, spreading the infection that way. And this MP was saying, the Prime Minister sort of, just say how ridiculous this is. Basically, it ended up, I don't need to go into the details, but it ended up with Boris Johnson saying there is no border between England and Scotland. Not sure. So not only has he failed his English language skills, but also his geography seems to be a bit lacking. There is a border between England and Scotland. It's an open border, of course, but there is a border. And I'm not just talking about a historical throwback. Apart from anything else, if there were no border between England and Scotland, how do you mark out the authority of the Scottish Government, for example, Mr. Johnson? And the other thing is, this is hilarious, there's a constituency that's called Penrith and the Border. Border's a region. There is an actual constituency which has an MP in Westminster, represents the border. And you know what? It's a Conservative MP. One of his own colleagues is the MP for part of the border. But then the Speaker got a bit of a laugh by saying after that, obviously, a bit of unpleasantness. And now on to the leader of the SNP. I don't think Ian Blackford needed to be asked if he thought there was a border. But anyway, so Ian Blackford, apart from, he first of all started relaying his thoughts to those injured in the unfortunate events in Glasgow last week, but he then challenged the Prime Minister on his speech yesterday, his self-professed relaunch speech. And he asked, of course, as he would, as leader of the SNP, what new money would there, in fact, you should argue for any Scottish MP should ask this, what new money will there be for Scotland? And he said when this was asked of the, I don't know what this, he asked it, but when it was asked of the Prime Minister's official spokesperson, what new money is there going to be in this speech for Scotland specifically, he said that the Boris Johnson's official spokesperson laughed. And he said that is what this government thinks about funding for the Scottish economy. He says they think it's a joke. Now, this wasn't recorded. We don't know to what extent it was a laugh or a derisory laugh or whatever. But, you know, the point was, the question that came from Blackford then was, can the Prime Minister answer a direct question? No waffle, direct question. What is there going to be in the Barnett consequentials, the money resulting from this speech for Scotland, specifically for Scotland? To which the Prime Minister, first of all, denied that the spokesperson would have laughed. And he said, you'll have to wait until next week for what money will be coming. And he banged on about the furlough scheme for Scotland. You know, and it's one of those things you would do as Prime Minister, because the furlough scheme obviously has helped people in Scotland. But at the same time, to suggest that, you know, that is somehow some act of charity on behalf of Westminster, when Scottish people pay their taxes as well, and is ridiculous. And to also suggest as if Scotland wouldn't have had such a scheme were it not part of the UK is also vaguely ridiculous. But what he then said is there's £3.8 billion for Scotland. Now, of course, that's not from the speech yesterday, because the total speech yesterday amounted to £5 billion of spending promises. There's no way in hell 3.8 billion of it was intended for Scotland. So Blackford noted that the Prime Minister couldn't answer the question because, you know, he wasn't talking about specifically the money from the speech yesterday. And he says, what were the Barnett consequentials from the speech from yesterday? And he says, the reason why the Prime Minister can't answer it is because there is none. He said this speech wasn't about levelling up. He says it's actually cruel in terms of letting people down. And he says, you know, and then his second question, he says, would he at least keep the freeze on benefit sanctions? I'm not quite sure how one went to the other, but, you know, there's a question. To which the Prime Minister, of course, didn't even touch that question. And he beseeched the right honourable members from the SNP, to admit that he was mistaken. Or the camera cut to Ian Blackford's face there. Oh, he wasn't happy. Didn't look impressed at all. But, of course, the key thing is that Boris Johnson, of course, did not answer the question. But he did promise wonderful things for Scotland. And those were his words. Wonderful things for Scotland. So there we are. That was the Prime Minister's questions, where Boris Johnson accidentally told the truth at one point. But there were still plenty of lies, which were called out as well. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further. Please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.